Europe, in the early 20th century, was a continent of both immense opportunity and deep instability. After the First World War, entire nations faced devastation, economic collapse, and political uncertainty. In Germany, the humiliation of defeat, combined with the harsh conditions of the Treaty of Versailles, created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. From this environment emerged a man whose ambition, ideology, and ruthlessness would plunge Europe into unparalleled destruction. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier and failed artist, rose to power by exploiting fear, nationalism, and resentment. He would go on to dominate nearly the entire continent through a combination of propaganda, terror, and military strategy. This is the story of how Hitler rose, how he expanded his control across Europe, and how his empire ultimately collapsed. Early life and formation of ideology, 1889 to 1918. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, Austria. His father, Alois Hitler, was a strict and authoritarian figure, while his mother, Clara, was gentle and devoted. Hitler's early years were marked by both discipline and a yearning for recognition. He moved to Vienna as a young man, seeking admission to the Academy of Fine Arts. Twice rejected, Hitler lived in poverty, painting postcards and sketches to survive. During these years, he encountered nationalist rhetoric and anti-Semitic ideologies circulating in Vienna. He developed an obsession with German identity and the belief that the world was controlled by those he considered enemies of the German people. When World War I broke out, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army. He found purpose in the discipline, hierarchy, and camaraderie of military life. He was wounded twice and decorated for bravery, but the war ended in defeat for Germany. Hitler, like many veterans, felt betrayed, convinced that Germany had been stabbed in the back by politicians, communists, and Jews. This sense of grievance, combined with his early exposure to nationalist and racial ideology, shaped the core of his political worldview. The post-war environment and entry into politics, 1919 to 1923. Germany in 1919 was a nation in crisis. The Weimar Republic struggled to maintain stability. Economic hardship, inflation, and social unrest created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. Hitler joined the German Workers' Party, a small nationalist organization in Munich. He quickly distinguished himself as a speaker who could captivate audiences with emotion, charisma, and promises of restoring Germany's former greatness. In 1920, the party became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler emphasized nationalism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism. He argued that Germany's defeat was due to internal enemies and promoted the idea of a racially pure German nation. In 1923, Hitler attempted the Beer Hall Putsch, an effort to seize power in Munich. The coup failed, and he was imprisoned. During his time in jail, he dictated Mein Kampf, a work that outlined his ideology, the elimination of democracy, the expansion of German territory, and the persecution of those he deemed inferior. Upon release, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party, gradually gaining influence amid continued economic and political instability. The Great Depression and rise to power, 1929 to 1933. The Great Depression, beginning in 1929, devastated Germany. Banks failed, unemployment soared, and millions of citizens faced hunger and insecurity. In this environment, Hitler and the Nazis presented themselves as the only party capable of restoring national pride, reviving the economy, and protecting Germany from foreign and domestic enemies. Through careful propaganda, mass rallies, and manipulation of democratic processes, the Nazis gained unprecedented support. By 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he consolidated power. The Reichstag fire of February 1933 became a pretext to suppress opposition, suspend civil liberties, and create the legal framework for totalitarian control. The Enabling Act gave Hitler the authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval, effectively dismantling democracy in Germany. Consolidation of the Nazi state, 1933 to 1938. Hitler transformed Germany into a totalitarian state. The Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, ensured that every aspect of public life reflected Nazi ideology. Education, media, art, and culture were carefully controlled to reinforce loyalty to the Führer. Economically, Hitler focused on public works, rearmament, and autarky. The construction of highways, factories, and military infrastructure reduced unemployment and strengthened the state. Politically, opposition was eliminated. Communists, socialists, and other dissidents were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Jews faced increasing restrictions, exclusion from professional life, social marginalization, and the confiscation of property. By 1938, Germany was fully under Nazi control, and Hitler's ambitions turned toward expansion beyond national borders. Expansion into Austria and Czechoslovakia, 1938. Hitler's foreign policy sought both unification of German-speaking peoples and territorial expansion. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what was known as the Anschluss. There was minimal resistance, demonstrating the power of Nazi propaganda and the weakness of European opposition. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia with a significant German population. European leaders, hoping to avoid war, agreed in the Munich Agreement. Hitler's promises of peace were empty. Within months, he violated them, taking control of the remainder of Czechoslovakia. These actions emboldened Hitler and signaled the failure of appeasement as a strategy for containing Nazi Germany. Invasion of Poland and outbreak of World War II, 1939. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland using a new military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry coordinated rapid attacks that overwhelmed Polish defences. Britain and France, honouring their commitments to Poland, declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Poland fell in weeks, and German forces employed brutal measures against civilians and prisoners. This invasion marked the beginning of a war that would engulf Europe for 6 years and result in tens of millions of deaths. Blitzkrieg across Europe, 1940. Following Poland, Germany turned west. In April and May of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, securing strategic positions along the North Sea. Next, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were invaded. France, despite fortifications along the Maginot Line, fell quickly. By June 1940, Paris was occupied, and the French government surrendered. Hitler's success was due not only to military innovation, but also to the failures and indecision of opposing governments. Nearly all of Western Europe fell under Nazi control, while Britain remained defiant. The Battle of Britain, 1940 to 1941. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. Western Europe had fallen in a matter of months. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and even mighty France had been crushed under the boots of the Wehrmacht. The world watched in disbelief as Nazi Germany's lightning warfare, the Blitzkrieg, swept across the continent like a storm. Only one major power now stood defiant: the United Kingdom, an island fortress, battered but unbroken. Hitler believed that Britain, isolated and outmatched, would soon come to terms. Yet Prime Minister Winston Churchill's words echoed across the airwaves. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." Britain's defiance enraged Hitler. If he could not bring the British to the negotiating table, he would bring them to their knees. His strategy was clear: destroy Britain's air defences, cripple its industry, and shatter its will to resist. The plan was codenamed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of the British Isles. But before his troops could cross the English Channel, the skies above Britain had to be cleared of enemy aircraft, and so began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe unleashed its fury. Waves of German bombers, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt Bf 109s, roared across the Channel. Their targets: British radar stations, airfields, and fighter factories. The aim was simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, before it could defend the homeland. But the Germans underestimated the British spirit and the skill of the RAF's pilots, young men from across Britain and from nations under occupation. Poles, Czechs, Canadians, Australians all joined the fight. They became known as the Few, immortalised by Churchill's words. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Day after day, dogfights erupted in the skies above southern England. The screech of engines, the thunder of machine guns, and the trails of smoke marked the deadly ballet between the Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts. Radar, a new and secret technology, gave Britain a crucial edge. Thanks to this invisible shield, RAF controllers could track incoming raids and direct their squadrons to intercept with precision. Despite being outnumbered, the RAF held firm. German losses mounted. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Hitler changed tactics. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe began targeting cities, most notably London. The bombing campaign, known as the Blitz, would last for months. Night after night, German bombers filled the skies. The sound of air raid sirens became a haunting part of daily life. Families took shelter underground, in basements and subway tunnels, as the capital burned above them. Entire neighbourhoods were reduced to rubble. Yet the British people refused to yield. Factories continued to produce aircraft and ammunition. Children were evacuated to the countryside. But morale remained remarkably strong. The message was clear: Britain would not be conquered from the air. By the end of 1940, the RAF had not only survived, it had triumphed. German aircraft losses far exceeded those of the British, and the Luftwaffe failed to gain the air superiority Hitler needed for invasion. Defeated in the skies, Hitler postponed and eventually abandoned Operation Sea Lion. It was his first major strategic setback of the war. The Battle of Britain was more than a military victory. It was a turning point in the fate of the world. It proved that Nazi Germany could be resisted, and that courage and unity could stand against tyranny. The skies over Britain became a symbol of freedom, and the British people, standing alone against the storm, became a beacon of hope for all of Europe. Operation Barbarossa and the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1943. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border, making it the largest military campaign in history. Initial advances captured vast territory, and millions of Soviet soldiers were encircled or killed. However, logistical challenges, resistance from Soviet forces, and the onset of winter halted the German advance. Cities like Leningrad and Moscow withstood prolonged sieges, and Soviet counteroffensives began to erode German gains. Operation Barbarossa failed to achieve its strategic objectives, and the Eastern Front became a prolonged and devastating theatre of war. The Holocaust, 1941 to 1945. As World War II raged across Europe, Adolf Hitler's regime launched one of the most horrific and systematic campaigns of mass murder in human history: the Holocaust. What began as policies of discrimination and segregation in Nazi Germany evolved into the deliberate extermination of entire populations deemed racially inferior or politically undesirable. From 1941 onward, the Nazi state implemented what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, a plan to annihilate all Jews within German-occupied Europe. Under the direction of Heinrich Himmler and the SS, millions of Jews were rounded up from across the continent. They were deported in overcrowded trains to concentration camps and extermination centers, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Upon arrival, families were torn apart. Many were sent directly to gas chambers, while others were forced into brutal labor until death from starvation, disease, or exhaustion. The Holocaust extended beyond the Jewish population. Romani people, Gypsies, disabled individuals, Polish and Soviet civilians, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals were also targeted for persecution and extermination. Nazi doctors conducted cruel medical experiments on prisoners, often without anesthesia or regard for human life. The genocide was executed with chilling bureaucratic efficiency. Orders were documented, transport schedules meticulously organized, and death tallies carefully recorded. German industry even profited from the use of slave labor and from confiscated property belonging to victims. By the time the war ended in 1945, an estimated 6 million Jews, 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, had been murdered. Alongside them, millions of others perished under Nazi tyranny. The Holocaust revealed the terrifying consequences of unchecked hatred, propaganda, and totalitarian power. When Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, they uncovered unimaginable scenes of horror: emaciated survivors, piles of corpses, and the remains of mass graves. These revelations shocked the world and led to the Nuremberg trials, where leading Nazi officials were prosecuted for crimes against humanity. The Holocaust remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, a stark reminder of the depths to which humanity can fall when prejudice and absolute power go unchallenged. Allied counteroffensives, 1942 to 1944. By 1942, the tide of war began to turn. The Battle of Stalingrad resulted in the surrender of a large German army, marking a significant defeat. Allied forces in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific gained ground, while the Soviet Union reclaimed territory in the East. Hitler's insistence on ideological objectives over strategic pragmatism led to repeated military errors. Resources were overstretched, supply lines were overextended, and morale declined. D-Day and the collapse of Nazi Europe, 1944 to 1945. By 1944, the tides of war had finally turned against Nazi Germany. After years of devastating battles, the Allies were ready to strike back on a scale never seen before. While the Soviet Union was pushing relentlessly from the east, British, American, and Canadian forces prepared a daring assault to open a new front in Western Europe, one that would seal Hitler's fate. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, better known as D-Day. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. In the early hours of the morning, over 156,000 troops crossed the English Channel and stormed the beaches of Normandy under a hail of German gunfire. The landings took place across 5 key sectors: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Resistance was particularly fierce at Omaha Beach, where American forces suffered heavy losses just trying to gain a foothold on the sand. By nightfall, despite the chaos and enormous casualties, the Allies had succeeded in establishing a vital bridgehead in France. This moment marked a decisive turning point in World War II. The Western Allies began their slow but unstoppable advance, liberating towns and cities as they pushed toward Germany. Paris was freed in August 1944, and by the end of the year, most of Western Europe was out of Nazi control. Meanwhile, from the east, the Red Army was crushing German forces in a series of massive offensives. Having already triumphed at Stalingrad and Kursk, Soviet troops swept through Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, closing in on Berlin. The Nazi war machine, once feared across the world, was now collapsing under the combined pressure of two unstoppable fronts. Inside Germany, the situation grew desperate. Allied bombers reduced cities to ruins, food supplies vanished, and morale among both civilians and soldiers broke down. Yet Adolf Hitler, refusing to accept reality, withdrew into his underground bunker in Berlin. Cut off from the outside world, he issued delusional orders to divisions that no longer existed, and blamed everyone but himself for Germany's downfall. By April 1945, the Soviets had surrounded Berlin completely. The city was a burning ruin, its streets filled with rubble and despair. Realizing the end was near, Hitler chose death over surrender. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life alongside Eva Braun, his longtime companion. Within days, what remained of the Nazi leadership surrendered unconditionally. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially capitulated to the Allies. The news sparked celebrations across Europe and North America. A day forever remembered as VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The fall of Berlin marked not only the end of the Third Reich, but also the collapse of a system built on violence, lies, and hate. Europe was left shattered, its cities destroyed, its people traumatized, yet the war's end also brought hope. The chance to rebuild and to ensure that the horrors of Nazi rule would never be repeated. Aftermath and legacy. Europe lay in ruins. Over 50 million people had died, cities were destroyed, and economies shattered. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity, establishing precedents in international law. The story of Hitler's domination of Europe serves as a reminder of the dangers of totalitarianism, propaganda, and unchecked ambition. It also demonstrates the resilience of nations and individuals in the face of tyranny. Adolf Hitler's rule over Europe was achieved through a combination of ideology, manipulation, and military innovation. Yet the empire he built collapsed under its own weight, leaving devastation in its wake. His story remains a profound warning. Even the most advanced societies can fall to tyranny if vigilance, accountability, and the protection of human rights are abandoned.